And we have our final presenter, Dr. Ahmed Tawakol, who's the Director of Nuclear Cardiology and the Co-Director of the Cardiovascular Imaging Research Center at Mass General. He's an Associate Professor of Medicine here at the Harvard Medical School, and his research includes a focus on multi-organ mechanisms by which stress and depression cause cardiovascular diseases. The title of Dr. Tawakol's talk today is Neuroimmune Cardiovascular Crosstalk, Mediating Heart-Brain Interactions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tawakol.
It's a pleasure to be here. My disclosures. So I'll begin by talking about psychosocial stress and heart disease. And we've long known that psychosocial stress has an attributable cardiovascular disease risk that's on par with that for smoking, dyslipidemia, hypertension, and diabetes. Yet relatively little had been known about the mechanism translating stress to cardiovascular disease. We've known from large studies like the Inner Heart, for example, where across the world, looking at 25,000 patients, that stress, no matter where you live, increases your risk of cardiovascular disease. And here they measured stress as work stress and marital stress. So how does stress lead to cardiovascular disease? Well, certainly it increases the risks of smoking, physical inactivity, overeating, hypertension, diabetes, and adiposity. But those alone don't show the risk. So to learn more about the risk, you can look at some animal studies. And this is a fascinating study out of the Mass General where they looked at a mouse model and they created stress there. And you can create stress by shifting the animal cages and moving them from one group of mice to another. That causes a lot of stress. Or you can put a cat over the cage. But stress actually activates the bone marrow. And there's a profuse immune response that occurs as you develop more and more productive bone marrow cells that go on to contribute to inflammation. And you can traffic those cells. You can follow them into the spleen where they're ready for the next inflammatory insult, or you can follow them straight to the arteries. And so if you can look at the arteries of control mice versus stressed mice, you can see the increased arterial inflammation. So first we asked, does this occur in humans? So does stress lead to this bone marrow progenitor release, splenic activity, arterial inflammation, and increased heart attack risk? And we also asked, well, what about the role of the brain? So you can start to get insights into the role of the brain with regards to stress by giving questionnaires like the PSS-10. Or you can look straight at the brain and look at neural networks. So for example, we heard about the prefrontal cortex and its importance in executive control. It turns out to be really important in controlling your stress systems. It moderates the stress systems, especially the amygdala within the limbic system. So now you can use advanced imaging to look at these regions. You can use PET to look at neural metabolism, and you can measure amygdala activity relative to counter-regulatory cortical activity, such as that from the prefrontal cortex. You can also use functional MRI to look at activation, and you can look at tissue volumes as well. So we indeed used a combination of that in a group of patients, and we sought to test the hypothesis that higher stress neural activity associates with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So we looked at the amygdalar cortical activity ratios, we looked at leukopoietic activity in the bone marrow, we looked at arterial inflammation, and we followed our patients for cardiovascular disease events. So this is what our population looked like. We started off with 579 patients. By the time we were done with all the brain imaging that we had to acquire, we had 293 patients. And this is what we found. So here are examples of some of the brain images. So here's an individual with a subsequent cardiovascular disease event. And look at this. This is the amygdala here. These are the bilateral amygdalae. And if you look at a ratio of the amygdala to the counter-regulatory activity, it was rather high. Whereas if you look at the person without a subsequent event, well, nice and low amygdalar activity here, and their ratio was relatively low. The person with high activity had high bone marrow activation and high arterial inflammation as well, whereas the person with low amygdalar activity had low bone marrow activity and relatively less inflammation in their arteries. Moreover, this high amygdalar activity here in red associated with a greater risk of events. So as you see here, more and more events occurred in those with higher activity versus those with lower activity. Here's the other interesting thing that we found. If you look at the timing of the cardiovascular disease events, Those who had near-term events within a year of imaging tended to have higher amygdala activity compared to those with the latter events or never events. And then when we look at the mediation here, this is where it got interesting. We simply asked, can we see a similar path in humans as was predicted in the mouse model? And here we found that the amygdala activity led to an increased bone marrow activity, an increase in arterial inflammation, and a higher cardiovascular disease, and that this mediation pathway was significant, providing some evidence of a similar pathway in humans as in mice. And this has been replicated in several groups since then. So for example, in this particular study, they looked at the association between amygdala activity and coronary plaques by CT angiography. And they found that the higher your amygdala activity, the greater your complexity of coronary plaques became. And that if you go from amygdala activity to coronary plaque phenotypes, again, the bone marrow is important. So keep on thinking about neural activity to the bone marrow to the arteries. And here in this other study, patients presenting with acute myocardial infarction, AMI, versus controls, those coming in with acute myocardial infarction tended to have higher amygdala activity. That makes sense. But then if you look at arterial inflammation and bone marrow activity, again, they associated with amygdala activity. Over and over, we see this trend. And finally, here in this study, they looked at recurrent events, patients presenting with strokes. They found that those with lower activity had a lower risk of recurrent stroke compared to those with higher activity. And again, the bone marrow was similarly predictive of recurrent strokes. So here's another interesting study. In this particular case, again, we're looking at the PET imaging of the amygdala, but here I want to drive this interesting finding. It's not all about the amygdala. I know I called it amygdala activity, but it's adjusted for cortical activity. So here we simply looked at patients with PTSD, patients exposed to trauma but didn't have PTSD, and healthy controls matched in age and general risk factors to the PTSD group. If you look strictly at the ratio of the amygdala to the counter-regulatory activity, these guys had the highest amygdala activity relative to the counter-regulatory, and these guys had the lowest activity. But watch this. These are averaged brain images. Now look at the healthy controls, had the highest prefrontal cortical activity, PTSD, the lowest relative prefrontal cortical activity. And look here, it's a light blue, and this is a red. Healthy controls actually had higher amygdala activity. It's not all about the amygdala. It's always about that ratio. So what's really driving the healthy neural networks here is nice high prefrontal cortical activity. And what's really bringing down the PTSD group is lower prefrontal cortical activity. Here's another interesting thing. So you can use MRI to look at the connections, the integrity of the wires between the aspects of your network. And here, when we focused on the tracts connecting the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex, the integrity was lower, you see this blue, compared to healthy controls, integrity was higher. And now, if we look at measures of atherosclerosis, looking at the carotids and looking at the burden of plaques, either amygdala activity, higher, predicted more atherosclerosis, or the tract integrity, as it goes lower, as your integrity improves, you lower your atherosclerosis burden. So there's either the relative ratio of activity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, or the health of the connections between them. Crosstalk between those two regions is important. So if I were to come up with an example of what we think is going on, you can see the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Their relative activity is going to lead to the amount of release you get down through these systems. So either HPA axis activation, poor relationship, less activity here or higher activity there, it leads to more HPA axis activation, more cortisol, more epinephrine. Interestingly here, that combines to depress antiviral functions and increase pro-inflammatory activation. If that's not bad enough, there's a lot having to do with the central nervous system and specifically the sympathetic nervous system activity. And these sympathetic nervous system fibers terminate in the bone marrow, and when activated, they lead to production of more of these leukopoietic cells as I described before. The combination of these heighten inflammation. So I talked about how you can have stress neural network activity leading to inflammation. So what does that have to do with stressors? So stress is not the same as stressors. So we can talk about two well-studied stressors, low socioeconomic status and chronic noise. And the reason I chose those two stressors is that over and over, they are associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So the question we have is, does a stress-associated pathway partially mediate the link between noise and socioeconomics on one hand and heart disease on the other? So first, looking at socioeconomics. In a study here, we looked at quartiles of income, and you can see that those in the lowest quartile, Q1 of income, had the highest cardiovascular disease risk. That's consistent with many studies that looked at socioeconomics and heart disease. And here's an interesting finding. Look at the amygdala activity relative to income. We found that as income went up here in quartiles, amygdala activity went down. Interestingly, beyond a certain income, it doesn't continue to go down, it's rather flat. We also found that arterial inflammation goes down by income. And if you look at the link between socioeconomic status and major adverse cardiovascular events, it is partially mediated by a serial pathway, including the brain, the bone marrow, and the arteries. So again, this is a recurrent theme about the leukopoietic axis linked to the brain. What about noise? In our study, as many others have shown, high noise associates with a greater risk of cardiovascular disease. But look at this, noise exposure, and this is noise exposure measured at individuals' front door of their homes. As it goes up, amygdala activity goes up, and again, noise to amygdala to artery predicts MACE. So putting this together, we can now look at the sum of measurable irritants. We can look at the number of stressors. Here we used income, noise, and neighborhood crime. And as you increase the number of stressors, you can see amygdala activity throughout this population goes up. But here's where it gets interesting. Now, here, if you look at people who don't have any of these stressors versus those who have one or more of these stressors, have a broad range of amygdala activity. Look at these. These are stress exposed, yet there are quite a few here in green that have relatively lower amygdala activity. Then you have this group over here with relatively higher activity. Let's call these people here more neurobiologically resilient. They're exposed, but manifesting less of the biophysiology. These individuals have lower resilience. Now, look at the impact of this resilience on cardiovascular disease outcomes. These are hard outcomes. So those with lower resilience have a greater event rate compared to those with higher resilience. In other words, even if you're stress exposed, if somehow you can reduce that stress neurological activity, there's a health benefit. That's important because people develop heart attacks upon exposure to acute stressors as well. And so we see surges in cardiovascular disease events during stressful periods. For example, if you look at several days before versus after an election, you can see an increase, a big bump up in terms of cardiovascular disease. And in fact, this is from 2016, identical data from 2020. Look at this for natural disasters. This is what you would see in California during, this is in the 1990s, really a metronome of expected heart attacks, except for on the day of the earthquake. So there's a big surge around earthquakes. And what about this? Sporting events. This is the World Cup, and you can see 2003, 2005, and then in red, 2006. You can see where it typically is in the area where the World Cup was held. This is in Germany. But look at these peaks. These peaks here were on the days that the home team played. And what's interesting too, on the days that the home team didn't play, there wasn't a big increase in heart attacks. And the biggest surges were during the quarterfinal matches and during an intense game where the home team won by 1 point during penalty kickoff. And then look at this, it plummets down to here. This was the finals. And why? Because the home team wasn't in the finals. So it is kind of interesting that the stress does matter. So going to another acute stressor. So Takotsubo, or broken heart syndrome, is something that leads to a profound reduction in heart function upon exposure to a stressor. And we wanted to understand if the brain imaging was different between people with versus without Takotsubo. And here are people we had brain imaging on before they developed Takotsubo. So we had 41 people who developed Takotsubo after imaging and 63 match controls. And look, these are the people with Takotsubo on average, higher amygdala activity compared to the controls, with a lot of overlap. But this is where it got interesting. If you took just the Takotsubo patients and looked at those with relatively lower activity versus higher activity, now they all subsequently got Takotsubo, but look, if you had lower activity to begin with, it took almost 3 years to develop Takotsubo after imaging, whereas here, it took less than a year. And when we first saw that, it was a little bit of a head scratch because the classic story for Takotsubo is you are greeted by the worst disaster in your lifetime or the worst news, and then you develop Takotsubo. Why would your brain imaging predict when that was going to happen? Well, it turns out people get Takotsubo for all sorts of things. Minor infringements, sometimes things that you can't even put your fingers on. And so we hypothesized that it's partly about what's going on in the brain. So if you have higher amygdala activity to begin with, you're less neurobiologically resilient. So then you're going to be interacting with more of these emotional and physical stressors, and you'll have a greater triggering of sympathetic system activity, inflammation, and hypercoagulability, leading to heart attacks, sudden death, arrhythmias, or Takotsubo. Whereas if you're more resilient, you have lower susceptibility, you're passing through these stressors with less neural activation, fewer physiologic consequences. So if you could change and become more neurobiologically resilient, how do you do that? Well, first of all, there are some really interesting studies. This 2016 study by the Blumenthal group showed if you randomize patients to exercise, cardiac rehab plus stress reduction versus exercise alone, there is a benefit here with a combination. In fact, an additional 50% reduction in heart attacks. Relatively small study, it's 226 patients, but still very interesting finding. Here's another thing that I can show. This is more recent work. So we looked at moderate alcohol and exercise. And here you can see if you compare individuals who drink light to moderately versus none, there's a reduction in this amygdala activity. And in fact, it's driven primarily through reductions in the amygdala activity itself. It didn't increase prefrontal cortical activity, and I guess I'm not surprised. Alcohol is not going to make your prefrontal cortex stronger. But exercise, on the other hand, very nicely reduces the amygdala activity. Here, exercise quintiles, and it's driven actually by the prefrontal cortex. There was a trend towards a reduction in the amygdala, but really what was most interesting is that exercise associates with an increase in prefrontal cortical activity. Then, if you look at mediation, we saw that light to moderate alcohol associated with a reduction in MACE, in part through reductions in amygdala activity, and likewise, physical activity reduced MACE in part through these changes in the brain. And so we stopped and we said, clearly mediation doesn't prove causation. But it was interesting nonetheless, and we said if we wanted to believe these results were suggesting a mechanism, we would figure that either light alcohol or physical activity would actually reduce MACE to a greater degree in people with stress or anxiety or depression, because that's where you see higher prefrontal cortical activity and potentially more of a brain gain from that. And that's what we found. So it wasn't subtle. So in a study of 53,000 here, 50,000 there, we found that individuals with anxiety and depression derived double the heart benefits from either light alcohol or from exercise. I do want to add that in this particular study that was published a couple of months ago, we did make a very strong point that at all doses of alcohol, we saw an increased risk of cancer, first of all. So this is not something that I recommend at all as an intervention. This is more of a proof of principle. And also at slightly higher degrees of alcohol than what I showed here, we saw reductions in all sorts of systems, including the prefrontal cortex. So it's cautionary there, but illustrates the interventions that go to the brain could have cardiovascular disease benefits that are not subtle at all, double the risk reduction. So what about Tai Chi and Qigong? So there are some studies. I do want to show that there's a study looking at individuals who practice Tai Chi, and they find that there's an improvement in the connections between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, and that those improvements correlated with improvements in pain and physical function. This is in patients with arthritis. Here's another brain imaging study that showed that Tai Chi, individuals who practice versus controls have thicker cortical regions, and also there are important functional differences. With Qigong, I don't have a lot to share, but that there is an association between the respiratory entrainment and changes in the activity within the amygdala. So intriguing ideas, and when I put them together, I've heard the wonderful talks preceding this, and I kept on thinking about the role of Tai Chi on the prefrontal cortex, giving you that cognitive reserve, but also its impact on inflammation, hopefully reducing the fascial inflammation as well. So stress is a common, important risk factor. Attributable risk is on par with hypertension, smoking, and diabetes. It associates with more activity in the neural networks, more leukopoietic inflammatory activity, more arterial inflammation and plaques, and ultimately heart attacks. Its impact might be modifiable. We need large trial, though, to show causation and look at the efficacy of interventions. But I'd say for people with high atherosclerotic risks, stress reduction approaches, including Tai Chi and Qigong, exercise, and healthy sleep, should be considered. Thank you for your attention.